work out in the heat or difficulty, and most of what I do, most of the time, most of it is just frustrating. You know what I mean? Then it can be tiring, but just kind of getting tired. You know what I mean? But I'm glad to be here tonight. Looking forward to our lesson tonight. And so let's go ahead and open up with prayer. And Bobby, would you open us in prayer?
Dear Heavenly Father, we come to you once again. We thank you for the opportunity to come out to your house. Dear Lord, be with Andrew as he teaches and with ones who are here. Dear Lord, just everything we say, do, let it be done to glorify your Son, Jesus. And dear Lord, may we lean on you. Amen.
Amen. Well, while you're go ahead and stand, let's do the announcements first. Then Sunday, we won't be here Sunday morning, so Brother Scott Bone will be here bringing the word. I will be back on Sunday evening, and I will be bringing the word Sunday evening. So I hope to see everybody there. On the 27th, my buddy David Kersey is going to come preach for us. I'm really looking forward to that. That's going to be wonderful. Looking forward to actually being able to sit down there and listen to somebody preach for a change. It's when you're a preacher, you got a calling that God gave you, and you have to do it. It's an unction, you know what I mean? But every now and again, it's nice to be fed instead of having to do the feeding. So I'm looking forward to that. Let's go ahead and stand and we'll sing Holy, Holy, Holy. Benny, that's green, number 6. The song relates the entirety of the concept of the Trinity.
Okay, 3, 2, 1.
You go through to
Is the amp on?
Yes. There's a slider that says Lord Almighty, early in the morning our song shall rise to thee. Holy, 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 merciful and mighty, God in 3 persons, blessed Trinity. Holy, 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 all the saints adore thee, casting down their golden crowns upon the blessed sea. Cherubim and seraphim, falling down before thee, who was and is and evermore shall be. Holy, 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 though the darkness hide thee, though the eye of sinful men thy glory cannot see. Holy, thou art holy, there is none beside thee, perfect in power, love and purity. Holy, 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 Lord God Almighty, all the earth shall praise thy name in earth and sky and sea. Holy, 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 merciful and mighty, God in three persons, blessed Trinity. Amen. I like that song. It talks about some very deep things.
Amen.
It says here that God is merciful and mighty, God in three persons. Benny, how many gods are there?
One.
One. The Bible is very clear there is one God. Yet the Bible is very clear that God the Father is God. There's nobody who disputes that. Everybody believes that God the Father is God. Jesus is God. The Bible's pretty clear.
Yeah.
Time after time after time it declares Jesus as God. Jesus claimed to be God. People say, well, where did he do it? When he says, before Abraham was, I am. What he was saying is, if you look at the language, that I am is the exact same words that God, when Moses said to God, God, who shall I tell them is sending me? He says, tell them that the I am is sending you.
Amen.
The self-existent one, the one who has always existed. And if we look here, it says here, look at the back, the bottom of that. Who was and is and evermore shall be. God has always existed. There's never been a time there wasn't God. In the beginning, there was God. There wasn't time, there wasn't space, there wasn't matter, there wasn't energy, there wasn't even nothingness. It was just God. And God created everything that was. He is always self-existent. Philosophy spends a lot of times contemplating your navel. It doesn't really accomplish a whole lot of times. But when you think about things deeply, you realize something. If you have a domino, one domino hits another domino, and that domino hits another domino, and so on. If you rewind that back, there had to be the finger that started the domino to fall, right? The Greeks philosophers called it the unmoved mover. There had to be an initiating cause, the great cause, the one who everything else came from. That is who God is. And there is none beside thee, the Bible says. Listen, we serve a real God. I love one of these days, sometime soon, I think I'm going to start going through the basic doctrines of Christianity, soteriology, Christology, all that. And just start laying out the basic Christian doctrines. Who God is, what do you know about God? What does God reveal about the nature of himself and the nature of man and the nature of things? Because once we understand, they say that when they train the Secret Service to detect counterfeits, the way they do it is make them very, very, very familiar with the real thing. Because once you understand the real thing, you can spot the counterfeits pretty easy. Benny, turn me down just a bit. I'm on time I do. All right, you have your Bibles. We're in Genesis chapter number 41. We should be getting old Joseph. You're going to run the scripture for me. All right, thanks, man. We're going to be getting Joseph out of prison tonight. So before we get started, let me pray. Heavenly Father, I pray that you bless the evening. Help me, Father, to teach. Lord, I pray that we get something out of this. And I pray, Lord, that you help us to learn about you, your word, what you've done. Lord, I pray if there's anything between us, Lord, give me help. So I'll be a clean vessel to be used of you. Help me, Father, to be what you would have me to be, and help this church to grow and to serve you better. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen. So Genesis chapter number 41, verses 1 through 4. We're going to start with that. And it came to pass at the end of 2 full years that Pharaoh dreamed and beheld he stood by the river. 2 years after what? Some people say it's been 2 years since Joseph was in prison, but the context seemed to be 2 years after the events in the last chapter, after the butler and the baker had their dreams, and Joseph interpreted their dreams, and the baker got hung, and then the butler got pardoned and went back to his job 2 years after that. So imagine you're Joseph. You have been serving God now for years. You didn't do anything wrong, but yet your brothers threw you in the pit. then they sold you as a slave. You served your master that you were sold to. Instead of sulking, you did the best job you could, and then all of a sudden you get accused with a false accusation and thrown into prison. Instead of getting all bitter and angry, you serve God the best you could do. You do what you're supposed to do, even there in the middle of the prison. And you wind up running the place. And now two high-profile people come in, and they have a dream, you interpret the dream, and then all of a sudden you say, remember me, please remember me. And it's been 2 years. Maybe you think God forgot about you. God didn't forget about him. Now Pharaoh dreamed and beheld, he stood by the river. When you're talking about Egypt, there's only one river that they ever think about. You know what river that is, right? The Nile. The Nile River is the center of Egyptian society. Every year it would overflow its banks, although it doesn't do that anymore. They put a dam on the river, and since then it doesn't overflow its banks anymore. But every year that river would overflow its banks, and when it did, it deposited a rich layer of silt on the land. And it made Egypt a very, very fertile place. They could grow about anything in that ground. And they made, here's the thing, and this is what our little protester people who want socialism, who thinks, if you ask them where food comes from, they'll look at you and they'll say, from the grocery store. They don't have a full grasp of society and reality. The fact of the matter is that the reason why you can have people do something other than become farmers is because you grow enough food to feed everybody. And in order to do that, you have to have a very rich soil. We've learned enough stuff so that we can put chemicals in the ground to replenish it and give it the nutrients that it wants so it can be fertile. Back in those days, they didn't have as much knowledge about things. So when the Nile overflowed its banks, it like supercharged the ground and made it capable so that a few farmers could support the whole nation. You can't have a large army and 99% of your people have to go out in the fields and work in order for them not to starve to death. You do away with things like fertilizer and tractors and all that kind of stuff. And we're going to go back to the days where everybody's growing their own food and everybody's going hungry. 2 years afterwards, he went into slavery when he was 17. He's about 30 years old now. For 13 years, he's been a slave. It says here, and behold, there came out of the river 7 well-favored kine. The word kine means cow or cattle. Well-favored. They were fat. They were plump. They looked like they hadn't missed a meal in a long time. They were just waddling up. If you're a butcher and you saw this cow, you'd say, man, I'm going to make some money on him. There's plenty of really good steaks and burger and everything else in this thing. It was well fed. There came set out of the river 7 well-favored kind of fat fleshed, and they fed in a meadow, because that's what cows do. As ruminants, they eat almost all the time. They have multiple stomachs. And behold, 7 other kinds came out of the river, ill-favored, lean-fleshed, and stood by the other kind upon the brink of the river, and the ill-flavored and lean-fleshed kind did eat up the 7 well-flavored and fat kind, and so Pharaoh awoke. In addition to the fact that the river would overflow its banks, they were also really big into fishing, and they got a lot of fish out of the Nile River. And the river also provided transportation. So it wasn't a mistake that God gave Pharaoh a dream about the river. And cattle was very important to Egypt. It was one of the most important domesticated animals they had. They used it for leather. They used it for food. They used it for transportation. They used it for tractors. And you take an ox and you put something on it, and whenever you got done plowing, you could eat it. The fact of the matter is, it was very important, and so it's a important part of the Nile's in the dream, and cattle's in the dream. And he saw 7 well-fed cattle coming out. They were grazing, just what cattle do. And the idea that they're grazing, that there's food there for them to eat. And then comes 7 miserable, skinny, puny, pathetic-looking cows, things that look like they're half starved to death. They're just disgusting looking. And they come and they gobble up these other cows. And then the Pharaoh awoke. Why did the Pharaoh awake? Because the Pharaoh, in his dream, this was as real as him sitting there watching it. And I guarantee you, watching little skinny, miserable looking cows gobble up these other cows would cause you to be a little bit upset. Number one, you don't really think about a cow eating another cow. They eat grass, they don't eat other cows. Well, Pharaoh woke up in a dead sweat. His heart racing, but he thought, well, it's just a dream. Stretched out in a big old royal bed. Maybe got up, gone on a glass of milk or something, went back to bed and just thinking, man, I shouldn't have ate that burrito that late or something. Laid back down. Verse number 5 says, and he slept and dreamed a second time. Behold, 7 ears of corn came up on one stalk, rank and good. And behold, 7 thin ears blasted with the east wind and sprung up after them. And the 7 thin ears devoured the 7 rank and full ears. And Pharaoh awoke, and behold, it was a dream. I don't know how long it took Pharaoh to fall back asleep, but I can guarantee after the second dream, he didn't go back to bed. It was so vivid in his mind. I know that might be an extrapolation, but when it says, and behold, it was a dream, he woke, and behold, it was a dream, that meant that in his mind, these things were as real as watching it yourself. You're right there. And it had that, you ever know a dream that just seems so real that when you woke up, you're disoriented for a little bit. You're still thinking that dream is real. That's the way it was with Pharaoh. It says, and he realized it was a dream. This time it was corn. Now, when the Bible uses corn, it's not necessarily like if you say they had meat, it doesn't mean that they had hamburgers. It means food, right? Sometimes a word can mean something in a more general sense than what we would use it today. When the Bible says a whale, it could be a big fish, it could be a whale. It's the same kind of thing. It's a more general term. It could be wheat. It doesn't have to be a corn on the cob or anything. But just understand that he was dreaming and he saw let's just use corn on the cob, a big old stalk of corn with 7 ears on it, just plump and full, looking juicy. You just want to pluck those off and get you some butter and have you some corn on the cob. Just wonderful. And then think about how bountiful that is. To have 70, you normally have maybe 1, maybe 2 or 3 ears of corn on one stalk, but have 7 ears. That's every farmer in the Midwest would jump up and down and do cartwheels if every one of his corn plants had 7 stalks of corn. Then there came the little puny corn, the dried up corn, the corn that wasn't good for nothing. Not even a single kernel could you get out of that, just useless stuff. And they devoured it. And he woke up, and he was in a cold sweat, and he was terrified, and it was so real. It took a few minutes for him to realize it wasn't a dream, and he did not, I don't think he went back to sleep. It bothered him greatly. He might have tossed and turned for a while. You ever done that? You're in bed, you just toss and you turn, you can't get to sleep, and finally you get up. And it came to pass, verse number 8, in the morning, that his spirit was troubled, and he sent and called for all the magicians of Egypt, and all the wise men thereof. And Pharaoh told them his dream, but none could interpret unto Pharaoh. You notice it didn't say he went back to sleep, so I don't think he did sleep the rest of the night. It said in the morning. He ordered all the wise men, all his counselors, all the magicians, all the people that was on his payroll, whose job it was to advise him. And back then they put a huge stock into what you dreamed. And there were people whose jobs it was to tell you what your dreams meant. Most of the time they were just guessing. I've found in my life most of my dreams is because I was thinking about something the night before. I went to sleep and I just started dreaming it because that's just what my brain does. You know what I mean? When you're stressed, when you're worried. I remember one time Rebecca was worried about work and she fell asleep. And she woke up screaming, "Get it off!" because she dreamed that this big old file cabinet thing fell over top of her to the shelf. And she was mad at me for about 15 minutes till she realized it was a dream and she got over it. But the point of it is, they were people whose job it was to tell the king what the dream meant, and they couldn't do it. Now, imagine paying a whole course of people to tell you what dreams mean, and they can't tell you what the most important dream you've ever had in your life means. I don't think Pharaoh was happy. I think he was, at the very least, a little bit grouchy. So, put that in context when we read the next bit of verses. And then spake the chief butler unto the Pharaoh, saying, I do remember my faults this day. Now, notice how he starts this. I guarantee he didn't want to volunteer this. He didn't want to bring up the memories. It's like, hey, remember when you just about killed me? Remember when you were so mad with me because I done something and you threw me in prison? You wouldn't want to remind somebody of that, but he's saying, he's like, uh-oh, the king needs some help. I need to help the king, right? That's the idea. He says, I need to do something to help out. And so he starts off by saying, I remember my fault. He's like, King, listen, I know I messed up. When you sent me to prison, you should have, and you're so wonderful that you forgave me of that. But anyway, the reason I'm bringing that up is he says, the Pharaoh was wroth with his servants and put me in the ward of the captain of the guard's house, both me and the chief baker. And we dreamed a dream in one night, I and he, and we dreamed each man according to the interpretation of his dream. And there was with us a young man, a Hebrew, a servant to the captain of the guard, and we told him, and he interpreted us our dreams. To each man according to his dream he did interpret. And it came to pass as he interpreted to us. So it was me he restored in mine office, and him he hanged. He was saying, now I messed up. I know I messed up, but remember that episode when you sent us to the prison. When we were there, we both dreamed a dream, and we both knew those dreams were significant. And there was a young man there, a Hebrew, who told us what the dreams meant and said it was going to happen in the future. And 3 days later, bam, just like he said, they came true. It was 3 days, wasn't it? Or was the next day? I'm not sure.
I think it was 3 days.
I'm thinking it was. I'd have to check and see.
3 days.
Verse 14. Then Pharaoh sent and called Joseph, and they brought him hastily out of the dungeon. Now I want you to think about Joseph. It's been 2 years. You don't know the king had a dream. You don't know the butler reminded the king of that. You get up like you have every day for the 13 years you've been as a slave, and the years that he's been in jail, and it's just another day. He sits down to have his breakfast. I guarantee you he's looking worse than a Duck Dynasty member did during the quarantine. Hair everywhere, beard everywhere. Your personal hygiene in prison is not the highest goal that you have, right? He's starting his day as normal, and all of a sudden these guards come. They grab him and they yank him out. I mean, they might say, we need you in the palace, or I don't know what they tell him, but they are on a mission. When the king says, bring him here now means as soon as humanly possible. So they bring him over. But you see, the thing is, this is kind of like us, okay? There's a little bit of an analogy here. You see, he wasn't fit to appear before the king. There had to be some changes made to his appearance before he was allowed to become in the presence of the king. Egyptian men shaved their heads bald. Not just their heads, their faces, not just their heads and faces, their entire body. They thought the body hair was kind of gross, and so they would mock him.
That little tuft in the back of there, like a.
That's genies. That's
No. And then they had a little.
They had like a gold beard thing there, but they generally, if you notice, you never seen a picture of a Pharaoh with long flowing locks. You know what I mean? They were shaved. So he's looking like a member of Duck Dynasty with hair going everywhere. He's looking like, some mountain man, and probably ain't smelling too good. He's wearing nasty prison clothes. So they bring him in, and as notice there it says they brought him hastily out of the dungeon, and he shaved himself and changed his raiment and came into Pharaoh. So, and I think there's probably a bath in there too, because if you're in jail, you probably don't smell well, and you're not going to bring somebody who's stinky in front of the king. If you offend the king, he could kill you. You don't want to offend the king. So they're trying to work pretty quickly, but they got them all cleaned up. When we come before the king, we can't come as we are. We cannot come as we are. We have to be cleaned up. We have to have the old garments thrown away and new garments put on us. We have to be shaven of our own nature so we'll be presentable for the king, just like Joseph. I thought that's a little interesting thing. Verse number 15, Pharaoh said to Joseph, I have dreamed a dream, and there is none that can interpret it. And I've heard it said of thee, that thou canst understand a dream to interpret it. He said, listen, I had this dream, I don't know what it means. These useless bums over here can't tell me what it means. I heard through the grapevine, you can tell me what the dreams meant. Now, the safe thing for Joseph to say is, absolutely, I can take care of that, no problem. That's not what Joseph said. And Joseph answered and saying, it's not me. God shall give Pharaoh the answer of peace. Joseph said, I can't, basically, and heard the gasp of everyone. Oh, wow. They brought him out of prison, they shaved him, put clean clothes on him, and he's not going to do it. He said, but God can. And the answer God's going to give you is going to bring peace. Joseph, even when he was standing before the king, he made sure that he gave credit to where credit's due. I can't do this. God can. Somebody said, Can you save me, preacher? No, I can't. God can. Can you help me? No, honey, I can't. God can. Right? We need to remember where the power and the authority is. And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, in my dream, behold, I stood upon the bank of the river, and behold, there came out of the river 7 kine, fat flesh and well favored, and they fed in the meadow. Now, think about that. They're feeding in the meadow. That tells you that the meadow was well watered. That tells you that the conditions are right for food. As the cows eat, then that's what sustains them. This is when we find out what that means, and I know you don't know it, but when we find out what that means, it's tied to the fact of the years of prosperity, right? And behold, 7 other kine came up after them, poor and very ill-favored, and lean flesh, such as I never saw in all the land of Egypt for badness. These are so pathetic, these are so pitiful, that, I mean, nobody would have a cow like this. If they got half that bad, you just put them down and eat it, because it's just, I mean, they're not the skin and bones, they were horrible. And the lean and the ill-favored kind did eat up the first 7 fat kine. When they'd eaten them up, I could not have known that they'd eaten them, but they were still ill-favored as the beginning. So I woke. He said, so the skinny cows, they gobbled up them big old fat cows. And after they ate them up, they still just as skinny as they was before. You couldn't even tell they had so much as a turnip, much less a cow. And he was like, and that's when I woke up. I have to find a place, I'm sorry.
22.
Well, yeah, I have to find it, okay. And behold, 7 years, and that's when and I saw in my dream, and behold, 7 years came up in one stalk, full and good, and behold, 7 years withered, and then blasted with the east wind sprung up after them, and the thin ears devoured the 7 good ears. I told this unto the magicians, but none of them could declare it to me. So, he was saying, when the 7 skinny cows come up and they gobble up the big cows, you're not going to be able to tell that they gobbled it up. There's something there. He knew that there was a meaning to this. He knew there was a significance to this. He knew that his musicians couldn't help him. By the way, the pop psychologists of today can't help you with your problems. They're not going to be able to give you a pill to solve the case that you're sinful. They're not going to be able to help all the issues that you have, but God can. Amen. This thing which
25.
Yeah, fine, I scrolled up, I'm sorry. And Joseph said unto Pharaoh, the dream of Pharaoh is one. God hath showed Pharaoh what he's about to do. Joseph said, listen, both your dreams, it's actually one dream. God gave it to you twice. They both mean the same thing. And God gave them to you. And God is telling you, Mr. Pharaoh, what's going to happen afterwards. Verse 26, and the 7 good kine are 7 years, and the good ears of corn are 7 years. The dream is one. Once again, he said, listen, it's the same thing. 7 cows, 7 ears of corn. It's all the same thing. And there's 7 years. 27. And 7 thin and ill-favored kine that came up after them are 7 years. And the 7 empty blasted ears, 7 empty ears blasted with the east wind shall be 7 years of famine. He says, okay. So you have 7 years of good and fat things and plenty of food, and 7 years of famine. He says, now listen, if you go a year with a famine, it's bad. You go a couple years with a famine, it's horrible. When you're talking 7 years, nobody has enough food to last them for 7 years. It's beyond anybody's capability, just about. Even today, we have food in our system for probably about a year, maybe 2 years, with all the canned food and stuff that we have in warehouses and stuff. But if they stop producing food, if there is no farming going on whatsoever, how long do you think the food supply could last? It definitely wouldn't last 7 years, would it?
Well, even at that, I mean, we just know from just March itself this year, I mean, there were times that there was no meat. There was no meat to be found. They had shut down the production of stuff. There was no toilet paper to be found for months.
Right, toilet paper and meat and now coins and stuff like that. Look, I understand that we couldn't weather that. But these folks back then, they lived a lot closer to the margin, okay? If we did not go to the grocery store, it would probably take us maybe 3 months to run out of food. I'm not saying the food we'd be eating is, wonderful food. We'd have lots of beans, lots of corn, stuff out of cans. But we could probably make do for a while. But the fact of the matter is, folks back then, they didn't have a whole lot put aside. They just didn't. 7 years, that's a horrible amount. Genesis 41:28. And this thing which I have spoken unto Pharaoh, what God is about to do, he showeth unto Pharaoh. Behold, there cometh 7 years of great plenty throughout all the land of Egypt. And there shall rise after them 7 years of famine. And all the plenty shall be forgotten in the land of Egypt, and all the famine shall consume the land. And the plenty will not be known in the land for reason of the famine following. And then for it shall be very grievous. And for that the dream was doubled unto Pharaoh twice, because the thing is established by God. God will shortly bring it to pass. God is going to do something, he says. God is going to do something. Now, you may ask, why is God going to send a famine? Why is God going to send years of plenty? Why is all this happening? To be honest with you, we know part of it. We don't know all of it. One of these days when we get to heaven, God can explain to us all the millions of reasons that he had for this to occur. Smart people often have more than one reason to perform a specific action, right? I'm doing it because of this, because of this, because of this. God understands things at a depth and a level you will never be able to obtain. And so if he were to explain to you his reasonings, I don't think we could even understand it all. But part of the reason for the famine was to get the children of Israel out of they were complacent. They were happy where they were at. But the problem is in Canaan, the people in Canaan were dragging them down. We saw what happened with Simeon and with Levi and with Reuben and with Judah. They were all following after the people of the land. And if God would have left them there, they would have soon been assimilated and there would have been no nation of Israel. God had to get them out of the land of the people so that then the God could deal with the people in the land, and then when they refused, he could judge them. Right? That was the purpose. That was the plan. God sent you 2 dreams, he says, so that you'll understand that it's from you. It's being doubled. He's underlining it. Now, God's going to send you 7 good years. Not just good years, super good years. I mean, farmers' wildest fantasies of what his farm could produce would be exceeded in these years. I mean, Benny kicked a jack-o'-lantern off, and now we have a pumpkin plant growing in our front yard. But imagine if everything grew even easier than that. And just stuff coming up in abundance. He says there's going to be 7 years of super duper plenty. Why? Because they needed to have enough to eat for those 7 years and have enough to store away for 7 more years. Right? So think about this. At the very minimum, they had to at least double the production of the land for 7 years. Right? Because if it took you 100 bushels to eat for 1 year, it would take you'd have to grow 200 bushels in 1 year to deal with today's food and then 1 year in the future. Right? Does that make sense?
Well, not only that, but you need to feed the animals too.
Right. Well, that's what I'm saying. Is whatever you produce this year was consumed this year. Very little stored back. I mean, you had stuff for the winter, but I'm saying you would grow, you would consume what you grew. There wasn't a whole lot of surplus. God's going to give them enough surplus. He's going to put miracle grow on everything. So they're growing at least twice as much food with the same amount of land as they did before. I'm thinking it's probably 3 times as much because they weren't just taking care of themselves, but against a whole lot of other people as well. Then afterwards, it's going to be 7 years, you ain't going to grow nothing. There's not going to be any food anywhere. It's going to be awful. It's going to be so bad, people are going to forget the good times. We've seen that. We'll have really good. We had a booming economy, one of the best economies in modern memory, with unemployment rate so low that it was making records every time they reported it. And then we had the coronavirus, and it's so bad people forgot about how great the economy was a month before. Think about 7 years of famine. Now, Joseph has interpreted the dreams. Did Joseph stop there? Joseph couldn't help himself. Remember, Joseph is Mr. Administrator. He went into Potiphar's house and pretty much got everything arranged, got everything working. He set things in order, was making Potiphar money hand over fist. He goes to jail. And I bet you he was making the jail captain, the jailer money. Everything was running right. He's an administrative guy. He wants things run right. And so he couldn't help himself. This is what he says. Now, therefore, he's going to give Pharaoh some advice. Now, therefore, Pharaoh, look out for a man discreet and wise and set him over the land of Egypt. And let Pharaoh do this and let him appoint officers over the land and take up a 5th part of the land of Egypt in the 7 plenteous years. A 5th part is how much, Bobby? What percentage rate? What's that?
25%.
It's 20%.
25.
Because there's, anyway, so that's it. And let them gather all the food of those good years that come and lay the corn under the hand of Pharaoh. Let them keep the food in the cities, and the food shall be for store to the land against the 7 years of famine, which shall be the land of Egypt, that perish not through the famine. He says, in the 7 years, don't just have a feast and consume everything. You need to take up. You need to put back 20%. Pharaoh should set somebody over this matter, so there's somebody in charge. If there's not somebody in charge of something, do you know what happens? It don't get done. At work, well, we have some projects where we don't have somebody who's really in charge of it, and it's just flapping in the breeze. Whenever something needs to come up, guys will come together and they'll figure it out and they'll get it done, but it's not really moving. It's not really going. There has to be somebody in charge of things in order for it to move. And in this case, he says you need to appoint you somebody to look over this matter. You need to take up a 5th part, take up 20%. Our tax rate right now, if you look at state and federal law, is more than 20%. So he was saying take up a tax of 20% of the food. I actually heard somebody when they cite this verse as the reason why we need to lower the tax rate to 20%. Like, because the Bible says you'll have abundance. You're twisting the Bible. I guarantee you that wasn't the only thing they were taking. They were also taking other taxes too. This was 20% more. But of course, God was giving them an abundance, so they had it. Just let's talk about this for a second. Is it God's plan for us to eat for us to consume everything that we have?
That's called gluttony. It's sin.
I'm not necessarily talking about food. We have money today, and in money, you'll see people, no matter how much money they make, they spend every dollar. They'll find a way to spend it all, and they don't even have 2 cents to rub together. If they have a flat tire on their car, they don't even have enough money to change the flat tire, which is why they got credit cards, and then they become a slave to the credit card company. God intended us not to consume everything that we take. I'm not the greatest on this. We have a little bit of an emergency fund that we socked away for emergencies. It's not much. I think it's We might have $1,000, which will take care of, maybe some tires if they go flat or something. But Proverbs 21:20 says, there is treasure to be desired and oil in the dwelling of the wise, but the foolish man spendeth it all up. In other words, the wise man doesn't consume everything he has. He saves it back. Proverbs 22:7, the rich ruleth over the poor, and the borrower is the servant of the lender. The word servant there is translated in all your newer Bibles incorrectly as slave, but that's the idea. It's almost like it makes him a slave. Proverbs 6:6-8, go to the ant, thou sluggard, consider her ways, and be wise, which hath no guide, overseer, or ruler, provideth her meat in the summer, and gathereth her food in the harvest. The ant goes and works all summer long, gathering up the food, and stores it up, and then during the winter time, when there is no way that the ant can go and find food, the ants do just fine because they've saved up and they've made a hand. God wants us to be wise and good stewards of what he gives us. I need to do better with this. I do. Most Americans, and I mean 99%, make too much money to live as broke as we live. And that's just the truth of it. Because we don't say no to ourselves at all. I need a mirror because I don't say no to myself either. So what he told Pharaoh was, listen, you need to save up this money. You need to save up this food. There's going to come a time that's going to get rough. You need to put something away for the future. Now, maybe he was nervous about his advice, or maybe he didn't even think about it because that's the way Joseph was. Verse number 37, this thing was good in the eyes of Pharaoh, in the eyes of all the servants. He wasn't just, that's a good idea. That's what we need to do, guys. We think his advisor, that's the best idea I've heard today. All these guys, they agree this is a good idea. And Pharaoh said unto his servants, can we find such a one as this is, a man in whom the Spirit of God is? He's looking around and says, Bob, I didn't hear you say anything. That wasn't a very good idea. And Tony, you didn't say anything either. So I don't think this guy, he's got the good ideas. He's the guy we need to put in charge of this thing, right? In the VeggieTale adaptation of this story, Pharaoh asks him, says, what does your soccer role look like? Talking about the administrative capability.
Worked at a pizza place.
Yes, I did. Benny. And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, for as much as God hath showed thee all this, there is none so discreet and wise. The word discreet there means one who can be trusted, that comes up with a good idea, a good solution. There's not going to be an error. In other words, it's like wise, but not. It's more like he's not going to make a mistake. He's not going to mess things up. There's nothing like that. I'm sorry, I thought I had more to read. And so, I wonder how Pharaoh knew this about Joseph. Think about this. He just met him just now. Do you think maybe, just maybe, that when they were bringing Joseph and getting him shaved and getting him cleaned up, maybe he was talking to Potiphar and said, he used to be your slave, didn't he? He said, yes, sir, he did. He said, tell me about it. Well, I'll tell you what, when he ran my house, it ran like a well-oiled machine. Everything was exactly the way it's supposed to be. It got to the point, I let him run the whole thing. He was making me money hand over fist. And then he talked to the jailers. Tell me about this Joseph fellow. Well, I mean, what can I say? He runs this place, man. He's whatever he sets his hands to, I can trust him. He works hard. He gets the job done. He doesn't complain. In other words, all those years that Joseph thought nobody was watching, all those years when he was serving God and doing what was right because it was right, not thinking that there's somebody watching, but there is always somebody watching. If he would have gotten lazy, if he would have gotten hateful, if he would have gotten down, then those stories would have come to Pharaoh. He may have been able to interpret the dreams, But he wasn't going to be the one in charge of things. How we live our lives when no one is looking matters. Because more often than not, number one, we're responsible to God for how we live our lives, and He's always there. But my point is, you don't know who's watching you. There may be times when you think you're all alone, but you're not. You may think nobody will see what you're doing, but they will. Joseph lived a life of integrity. And I'm thinking, while he's getting dressed and ready to come before the king, the Pharaoh is hearing the stories of Joseph. And he says, I know that you're wise. I know that you're discreet. I know you do all these things. He says, I know I can trust you. He listened to the stories of those men, and he knew Joseph was a guy he could trust. That's why it's important we control ourselves. We control our attitudes. I know sometimes you get down. Sometimes you get burned out. Sometimes you get tired. That's not an excuse not to do what you're supposed to do. His attitude mattered. Verse number 40. Thou shalt be over my house according unto thy word, shall all my people be ruled. Only in the throne will I be greater than thou. He said, listen, you're going to be in charge of this, and you're going to be number 2. You don't have to worry about working out, well, Pharaoh, I needed to do this, but so-and-so said he wants to do this instead. He says, no, you're number 2. I'm the head guy, and everybody else answers to you. You run it the way you need to. This is something that's important. One thing they've learned in this coronavirus stuff is that sometimes bureaucracy needs to be kind of like just pushed aside to get things done. Where I work, there are people working on the COVID project from a whole bunch of different agencies. And they just said, okay, you're doing this now, and all their other stuff is falling aside because they got to do this now. And there has to be that authority. And Joseph was given the authority that he needed to accomplish this. Anything that he said went. And if somebody complained, they had to go to Pharaoh and say, he's not doing it the way I'm going to do it. And Pharaoh would say, I don't care. And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, see, I have set thee over all the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh took off his ring from his hand and put it upon Joseph's hand, and arrayed him in vestures of fine linen, and put a gold chain around his neck. So he's decking him out. The ring that he put on, what kind of ring do you think it is?
Signet ring gave him authority.
A signet ring that gave him authority. Exactly. What other brother of his had a signet ring? Judah. One brother, his signet ring that he had brought him shame. This signet ring brought glory. See the parallels between the brothers? It's interesting. And he made him ride in the second chariot which he had, and they cried before him, bow thy knee, and he made him ruler over all the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, I am Pharaoh, and without thee shall no man lift up his head or foot in all the land of Egypt. You have authority over all of them, son. Don't you let anybody tell you different. You're number 2. I'm number 1, you're number 2. Anything you say goes. The only person who can contradict you is me. And so this guy, think about it. We'll talk about that in just a second. I always get ahead of myself for some reason. You're going to be over my house 13 years. It took 13 years for him to go from the pit to the palace. It took 13 years from being the lowliest of the low to the elevated to the spot, the highest spot that a man could be at, of the Pharaoh. Joseph had talent. It was natural. He had it at home. He had it there. His dad was trusting him to do some administrative stuff we can infer from the scriptures. But talent will only take you so far. It helps you do a good job. He had some skills too. See, talent is your natural ability, and skills are something that you can develop, right? And so he had skills too. Over the years, he learned to hone his natural talents into skills where he could administer stuff. But skills will only go so far. It helps. But for him to be what God wanted him to be, there was an aspect of his nature that God had to craft, and that is his character. You see, it's okay for you, it's easier for you to be a selfish self-centered individual, when you don't have any power or don't have any money, you can get by with that because you can't hurt yourself that much, right? But if you're the second in the kingdom, you have to have that character. And so God, for 13 years, has been putting Joseph through all this stuff because he needed to develop in Joseph that moral character, that fortitude. So when I want you to think right now how you would act if suddenly somebody gave you $1 billion. Do you really think that you what would happen in your life? Would you use it for good? Would you use it selfishly? Would you use it to hurt other people? See, the thing is, like money and power, they magnify what a person really is. Joseph was a good man, and through the 13 years that he spent in slavery and in humiliation, he developed a strength of character. He developed a reliance on God. So when God gave him the ability to be in that position, it didn't break him. There's so many stories about people who like win lotteries and then they just turn into horrible people. No, they didn't turn into horrible people. They were before, and the money just magnified what they were.
I think also too, I think he was very immature being close to the youngest. You know, he was tattletelling on his brothers. He thought he may have been doing the right thing, but he was kind of immature. I think it's between Potiphar in the prison and now Pharaoh. I think that it was a more mature thing, maturity, grew him in maturity.
So in other words, you're right. I'm not disputing that. That's part of character as well. But the whole point of this is that sometimes you go through things in life, not because God's wanting to be mean to you. Dave, when we went to basic training, we had them drill sergeants, and they like to yell at us, didn't they? They made us do things we didn't want to do. Get up long before we wanted to get out of bed. And they made us do push-ups and sit-ups and run and all this other stuff. But you know what? The reason they were doing that is because at the end of that, we gained muscle. We were able to do more than we were before because it's only through opposition that we actually gain strength. That's the truth. Joseph had to go through all this heartache, but as he did, it's just like being in basic training. He was developing an internal strength. If you can deal with your boss's wife lying about you and sending you to prison, you can deal with the backbiting idiots in the court. Because I guarantee you, every single court has people who backbite you. If you don't, I mean, we have it today. I mean, one person says this about this other person, and all the political backbiting and stuff that goes on is horrible. Joseph developed some calluses. Those years God used for good. He was making Joseph into something. And Pharaoh called Joseph's names Zaphapaneah, and gave him to wife Aneseth, the daughter of Potiphar, the priest of On, and Joseph went out over all the land of Egypt. Now, the Jewish legend says that the letters of Joseph's Jewish name, by linking them together as seer, redeemer, prophet, supporter, interpreter of dreams, clever, discreet, and wise. The literal meaning of the name is God speaks and he lives, referring to the fact that God's words came through Joseph. Now, Joseph gets a wife. The lady he gets married to is a daughter of a pagan priest. Her dad's from a town called On. That's probably the town of Ptolemy, which is also called Omni, and it's about 20 miles from the city of Memphis. Not Memphis, Tennessee, but Memphis. Aneseth means belonging to Neith. Neith is the Egyptian goddess, known as the cow of heaven. She's a goddess of war and hunting, and her symbol is 2 arrows crossed in front of a shield. And she's one of the oldest goddesses in Egypt. The fact of the matter is, this is an aside, just a question. Right now, the Jewishness of an individual is traced through the mother, not the father. And so if your mother was a Jew, you're a Jew. Remember Timothy in the Bible. His father was a Greek, but his mother was a Jew. Timothy was a Jew. Timothy got circumcised so he could go into the temple. You remember Titus. Both of his parents were Greek. Paul didn't circumcise him. Why? He wasn't a Jew. The Jewishness comes through the mother, not through the father. So here's the question. How in the world did this lady give birth to a couple boys who became Jews? Boy, got quiet. There's also there's two different Jewish things I read about this. Number one, some say that she that she became a follower of Jehovah, that she became a follower of Yahweh, that she became a proselyte Jew, which after she sees her husband and his faith, it's completely possible when she realizes it's a real faith instead of the God that her father served. Others say that she was actually part Jewish herself, that she came, I forget exactly what, that she was Jewish in her bloodline.
That would be a little bit more believable because it's the blood of the Jew that makes them a Jew, right?
Well,
if we were
Ruth,
adopted into the family of Jews, we're not Jews, but we're adopted.
No, because you could be a Jew by birth, or you could be a Jew by joining them. Remember Ruth, the Moabitess, she became a Jew. Remember Rahab, she became a Jew.
Both ladies are in Christ's lineage.
You get pretty much everyone in Christ's lineage as a Gentile. The mother of the children from whom Christ comes, from Judah. Remember, she was it Tamar?
Yeah.
I was thinking Tamar, but then I had one of those senior moments. I was doubting myself. And Tamar, she was a Canaanite, right?
Yeah, I didn't think about that, but you're right.
So I'm not sure. It's just something I threw out there.
Well, it would, either way, it would have to be that if she wasn't a Jew, she became a Jew.
Yeah.
So regardless of whichever way it was, because if she was a Jew, if her mother would have had to have been a Jew for her to be a Jew. But in order to do that, we know that Joseph's family was in Canaan. They stayed in the area. They didn't go to Egypt.
Right.
So the only other way that it could come from would be from Esau and his family.
Right.
But if it
Or
came
from the children of Keturah too, but those would be Abrahamic. That wouldn't necessarily be
well, that's what I mean. So I think that she probably became a Jew rather than being born one.
And Joseph, it said that there in the previous verse that he went out over the land of Egypt. He hit the road and he started working. He started putting everything in place to get everything ready. Verse number 46, and Joseph was 30 years old when he stood before Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh and went through all the land of Egypt. He was 17 years old when he was thrown into the pit. This 13 years later. He started working, started traveling. Now, Joseph's life was one of sudden changes. I want you to think about this. One day, he woke up at his dad's house and went to go visit his brothers. The next day, he woke up being a slave. One day, he woke up being the chief servant in Potiphar's household, and that night, he went to sleep in prison. And then one night, he went to sleep in prison, and the next day, he's sleeping in a royal bed in the palace itself. Verse number 47, and in the 7 plenteous years, the earth brought forth handfuls, and he gathered up all the food of the 7 years which was in the land of Egypt, and laid the food in the cities, and the food of the field which was round about every city, he laid up the same. Just like Joseph said, here comes the 7 good years, plenteous years, he collected it, he stored it. It said here in verse 50, and unto Joseph were born 2 sons before the years of famine. So he was married, and in the first 7 years of his marriage, he has 2 kids. And Nessa, the daughter of Potiphar, priest of On, bare unto him, and Joseph called the name of the firstborn man Manasseh. For God, he had said, made me forget all my toil in my father's house. Now, Manasseh means one who causes me to forget. It forgets, he says, well, he saw that baby and he says, it's like I've forgotten the years of slavery. I've forgotten the years of prison. Everything's new now. Everything's better now. And he realized God had a purpose and a plan all along. That if he hadn't been sold into slavery, if he hadn't been thrown into the pit, if he hadn't been into prison, then he wouldn't be where he is today. And he wouldn't have this little baby. And he forgot all about his toil. When he said he forgot about his father's house, he doesn't mean that he forgot about his father's house, but it means he forgot about what they did to him. He let the bitterness go. And the name of the second is called Ephraim, for God hath caused me to be fruitful in the land of my affliction. Ephraim means fruitful. And the 7 years of plenteousness that was in the land of Egypt ended, and the 7 years of dearth began to come according to Joseph had said, and dearth was in all lands, but in the land of Egypt there was bread. He put it away, and then whenever the first year came, there was no crops, everybody was getting nervous. They had plenty to eat in the land of Egypt. They didn't have it anywhere else. They had it to eat in the land of Egypt. And all the land of Egypt was famished, and the people cried to Pharaoh for bread. And Pharaoh said to all the Egyptians, go to Pharaoh, and what he said to you, do. Pharaoh said, don't ask me, I'm not in charge of this. You two go talk to him. 7 years he's been in charge of this, you talk to him. So Joseph, let's see what Joseph said. And the famine was over all the face of the earth, and Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold unto the Egyptian, and the famines waxed sore in the land of Egypt. And all the countries came into Egypt for Joseph to buy corn, because the famine was so sore in all the lands. He sold grain not only to Egyptians, but also to everybody else who came in. And notice, but this is in the very early days of Egypt. This is before their wealth and their power. This is probably one of the ways they got the wealth and the power, because nobody else had food and they could corner the market. I'm not saying they took advantage of people, but I guarantee you that they did pretty well. If you're the only store selling snow shovels in the middle of a blizzard, you're going to do well, right? So, we can take a lot of, next week we're going to talk about how Joseph met his brothers, and we're going to find out some things. But think about Joseph's life just for a second, and then compare it to your own. Joseph, out of no fault of his own, went through all kinds of horrible problems. Joseph, he was sold into slavery, lied on, treated horribly, despite the fact that he was honorable and did everything right. Because he kept his head up, because he kept working, because he trusted God. God took care of him. I think that a lot of times in our lives we get down. Listen, you don't know how the puzzle piece you're living in right now fits into another puzzle piece, but God does. You may not know what tomorrow holds, but you know who holds tomorrow. And God's the one that's in charge. That's all I have. David, you dismiss us.
Thank you, Lord God, Heavenly Father, for this beautiful day, Father, for each and every one made a way out, Father. Thank you for the teaching from our pastor, Lord God, Father. Thank you for this little church, Father, and all the blessings that you place on us, Father. Lord, we ask that you watch over us, Father, and until the next appointed time we come together, Father, to praise, glorify, and uplift you, Lord. Thank you, Father. May I fall back in the name of